Well, that is a good point. The indication I have is yes, it has been begun. It has started. We are recording our workshop or working group session.
Okay, and then just real quick, Fred, do you want to say anything before Jonathan speaks?
No, I just would just welcome everyone to today's session. Appreciate all of the interest, and I'm looking forward to the discussion on wildfire risk calculation.
All right, thanks. Jonathan, are you able to unmute and say a few words?
Thanks, Joe. Yes, thank you very much. Also, Fred, for the opening remarks there, and thanks everyone for attending the workshop today. We do want to make sure that we answer all questions that were, put forward to us and address them in a way that's going to satisfy, the various ways that the questions have been asked in the past as well as, now. So, that's our intent. Our goal is to answer as much as we can. I just want to also just remind everyone that this risk modeling effort is something that is continuous, right? It's something that continues to improve and continues to evolve. And it's not just, one steady approach that's been used right in the past. So we keep advancing it. So with that in mind, right, where we were maybe, a little while ago may not be the same as where we are now. So we're trying to balance what we share in terms of the development that's occurred, right? We're trying to keep everyone abreast of that. We know that this is also a new area, right, in terms of the risk modeling and being able to quantify the various risks associated with wildfire, and also including the PSPS role and impact. And so we have been trying to accommodate all of that into the modeling. And we're going to be as transparent as possible and share these items. But I want to also emphasize the fact that there's a lot of work that's involved in detailing all of this out, and some of it may not be quite as refined as maybe is being asked, right, in the moment. So just keeping all of that in mind, we're going to do our best to share and be as transparent as possible with how we answer the questions, and want to turn it back to you, Joe.
All right, thanks a lot. And we'll just bypass the technical difficulties, if you will. What we're trying to show, again, I put together just a real high-level intro slide. As I mentioned at the beginning of Tuesday's workshop, for those of you that were here, we had a ramp follow-up workshop on Tuesday specific to SoCal gas risks. Today is the second of 5 workshops that we've scheduled over the next couple of weeks. The agenda topics are based upon feedback that we received from the parties. Thank you. And then also both during the last couple of workshops, and then also for a request from Fred to submit topics, agenda topics, and questions for future workshops. Received a document from both TURN and CalPAO. Today's workshop is specific. The agenda is specific to, it's a 2-hour workshop, so specific to the questions TURN had submitted. There were 3 of them. Well, not that they so much submitted 3 questions, but within their suggested topics for future workshops, they said wildfire. They had mentioned RC, review RC calculations for wildfire, and they mentioned the typical types of questions that they would anticipate reviewing. I think that's a fair assessment. Is how the pre-mitigation risk scores and mitigation effectiveness values are determined, and the sources and rationale for the input of calculations. How the WINGS model work papers relate to other work papers that have been provided, and how the scope of the proposed mitigations was determined. That's what was on the slide that we're trying to show you. And so again, the idea is to go over those questions, and then certainly any additional follow-up questions TURN would have, and then other parties. CalPAO, as I mentioned, also submitted suggested topics for future workshops. One of their suggestions was also for wildfire. We have a workshop scheduled for next Wednesday, the 8th. The idea is to be similar to today's workshop, which is focusing on the questions TURN had submitted. Next Wednesday's workshop will focus on the questions and topics that CalPAO had submitted. That was the approach I was thinking would work out. And I think that's it. I think it was around noon, I sent an email to the contacts for the parties, the party contacts of the proceeding, and other members of the parties with that intro slide. And then also, I think with 3 different spreadsheets, 2 of them specific to the wildfire spreadsheet, wildfire risk, and then also a wings work paper. The idea is we anticipate Mason sharing those and going over data and data sources within those work papers. So again, wanted to provide them to the participants, to the party members prior to this workshop. Hopefully you all received them. If there's anyone that did not receive it, I should be able to forward it to you. And then that's all. That's my intro. And then before we hand the mic over to Mason, there it is. If you want to go to the second slide, there you go. Yeah, as I said, those are the 3 typical type questions. Tom, hopefully I characterized it correctly, that you guys had submitted. And so, as I said, before I hand it over to Mason, are there any questions from folks on the call?
This is Marty Kurtovich. Which workshop are we going to be getting into the details of the proposed mitigations?
You're talking about the wildfire mitigations?
Right.
Well, today we're going over, these are the 3 questions that Tern had submitted for overview of a workshop. And the first one is pre-mitigation risk scores and the mitigation effectiveness values as determined. I think that's all part of today's discussion, if you will. Part of the mitigation effectiveness values, those are part of determining the RC values for the mitigation. So I think that's certainly a viable discussion for today's workshop.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
This is Joe Mitchell from Musty Grade. Can you discuss what we'll be talking about with the next wildfire meeting so that we don't overlap in our questions today?
Sure. I did not prepare a slide for today. CalPAO, when they submitted their topics for our future workshop, they identified a series of questions, and it's those questions that we'll be going over. Sorry, I don't have a copy of that. Some of their questions I think were specific to updates of the of data that was in the wildfire mitigation plan. Some of their questions pertain to how customer data was utilized when developing the PSPS related mitigations. The other questions just sort of don't ring a bell, but so I just don't have. To the extent you ask a question today, let's put it this way: if you ask a question today and we are able to answer it, we're going to answer it. We're not going to say, "Oh, that's an agenda topic for next week." To the extent we're not prepared to answer it because we're still prepping to answer that for next week, I think it might be fair to give that answer then. But if we're able to answer a question today, we're going to answer it.
Thank you.
All right.
So Joe, I'll come off mute here for a second, but I want to make sure we're on the same page. So we have these 3 bullets we'd like to cover today, and we don't necessarily have a calendar around, how long we're going to spend on each bullet. So I think what we're going to do is sort of open up some spreadsheets, give a brief overview of what we're looking at, and then if Tern has any specific questions, we can answer them to the best of our ability. And if we can't, we can, take that question and get back to a later date. And then as for the second and the third bullet, I think we're just going to find a natural break of try to, fit the time in so we have time to hit those topics as well. So I kind of think that as the spirit leads, but we don't want to dwell on the first bullet for too long because there are 2 other bullets. I'll just throw that out there.
This is Tom from Tern. Thank you, Mason. We have prepared quite a number of questions, so the sooner we're given an opportunity to just start asking our questions, the better as far as we're concerned.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Tom.
All right, Mason, you want to see if you can start sharing?
I can, and before I do that, Tom, do you want to go in a specific order? I can do sort of the overall risk score spreadsheet first, or we can look at the mitigations. I'll control the slides. It's not slides, it's the spreadsheet. I'll have the ability to kind of jump around. So what would you prefer?
Yes, thank you, Mason. I would prefer if you would start with the file that's labeled Final 2021 Work Paper. It doesn't have RSE in the title. So I don't know how you refer to that, but that's got 5 tabs, including risk scoring, work paper, and RSE summary.
Okay, bear with me. I'm not a Cisco expert. We use Microsoft Teams quite a bit. So can you give me the name one more time, Tom?
Well, the file name is Final 2021 Work Paper. It doesn't have the word RSE
Okay.
in the title, and then it's SDG&E Wildfire Level 2.
Okay, perfect. Okay, here we go. Let me see if I can share. So if I click there, like I said,
All right, success.
can you see?
We can see it.
Okay.
You may
Now,
need
yes.
to make it a bit bigger.
Okay. Yeah, that's the kind of feedback I need. I don't know what it looks like on other people's slides. I will say yesterday I was having a little bit of network. So if my audio drops out or video drops out, I apologize in advance. So.
And Mason, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
If you could go to the last tab, the RSE summary tab, that's where we want to start. Perfect. So Mason, did you have any introductory remarks, or should we just go right to questions?
I mean, so thank you, Tom. I think generally speaking, just for the audience who knows, this is our RSE summary file that we have for wildfire. The IDs on the left are the IDs that are used within the RAMP filing, and it's consistent throughout. So if you're looking for a particular mitigation, you can use the ID to help you find it. What you see is many columns here that helped us to, in the end, determine the RSE over here in column Z. So lots of inputs following the settlement agreement, lower and core. One thing I want to point out to everybody before we really get going is that wildfire contains a PSPS piece and a wildfire piece. So throughout today's conversation, you're going to be hearing about both of those components, and they total up to the total wildfire risk score. So there's that notion. Wildfire is the only risk chapter where there's kind of 2 lower and cores separated, and we've documented why we think it's important to do that. But other than that, Tom, I think we're good to go. So ask away, and hopefully I can answer your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mason. Could I just ask a background question first? I think to help put this all in context, Mason, do you have a ballpark number of overhead distribution miles in tier 3, tier 2, and the non-HFTD?
The great thing about working from home is that I have a team that's probably already trying to find that answer upon your request. I don't have those memorized. I don't want to guess at it incorrectly.
Okay.
So the people on the call, they know who they are. Once that information comes up, I will present it to you.
Excellent. Excellent.
And this is Marty Kurtovich, and usually the number I hear is 3,500 to 4,000 miles in the high fire threat districts.
The total in this is Sarah from SDG&E. The total in the HFTD is 3,500 miles roughly. We're pulling up the breakdown between tier 3 and tier 2, so we'll have that shortly.
Okay, that's really helpful. When you get that, just chime in. That would be great. And then for non-HFTD,
this is sorry. Yeah, this is Sean from SDG&E. I have the numbers up here. Our total overhead distribution miles in the HFTD is 3,464 miles. Tier 3, that's 1,647 miles. And tier 2 is 1,817 miles.
great.
Do you have the number for transmission assets?
Yes, I do. HFTD miles for transmission, approximately 996 miles. 269 in tier 3. 727 in tier 2. And I'll just caveat this. This is off my my workbook, which doesn't have the most up-to-date GIS verified numbers, but they should be pretty close.
Well, that's great. And I was really just looking for ballpark. So you've exceeded my expectations. So thank you. Okay, so on this work paper, RSE summary tab, I'm working off of I just have it on a different screen, so I'm able to, it's a little more legible for me. It may be hard for some to follow.
Okay.
But everybody has that option because Joe kindly sent the work papers in advance of this workshop as well. So people can do that on their screens if they have capability. Okay, so we're going to ask you to look at a few particular columns with respect to a few of the different mitigations listed here. Just for, in part because they're some of the most major mitigations, we're going to be asking you about the covered conductor mitigation, which is C7M2, and that's for tiers, and there's separate rows for tiers 3 and 2. I think it's row 11 and row 12. Yes, thank you for highlighting those. We'll also be asking you about the undergrounding related rows, which I believe are 25 and 26. That's
Okay.
mitigation C16, M11.
Mhm.
It's just to give people a little advance notice about what we're going to be asking about. We may get into a little bit, I don't know, about tree trimming, which is C31, rows 43 and 44. And maybe a little bit about enhanced vegetation management, which is C33, M16, rows 46 and 47. So that's just a preview.
Yep.
Help folks get ready. Thanks for highlighting those. Now let's go to the rows 11 and 12. Let's start with row 11. That's covered conductor for tier 3. I'm just going to scroll to that on my screen. So we're going to be really trying to understand how you got column O is percent change in wildfire lure. And as we said the other day, because for most of these mitigations, the RSE is all about the reduction in the lure. That's what's driving the risk spend efficiency. There's generally, with the exception of the PSPS part of things, my understanding is that generally there's little if no impact on the consequence side of the equation.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I think you've said that before. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about that. All right, so that's why we're looking at this column O, percent change in wildfire lure. So if we look at rows 11, look at row 11, that says that this mitigation covered conductor as proposed in the scope proposed for the 3-year period that SEMPR is looking, or SDG&E is looking at, it will produce a 6.61% reduction in the wildfire lure. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I know you mentioned earlier there's a PSPS side of things. I don't think the PSPS part of it is particularly impactful, I guess. But there is a minor effect from PSPS. Is that right?
Correct.
On the PSPS RSE, I should say. Yeah. All right, so let's focus now on the 6.61%. First, the question is, what does that mean exactly? And here's what I'm thinking it means, but you tell me if I'm wrong about this. Across all of tier 3, the frequency of a reportable ignition with the application of this mitigation covered conductor as proposed by SDG&E will fall by 6.61%. So that's, in other words, the frequency is going to go down by 6.61% across the entirety of tier 3. Is that right?
Actually, the way you worded it, let me do a quick question here. I'm trying to clarify. I want to be as accurate as we can.
Okay.
If the 6.61 is for the tier 3 reduction or the system reduction, and I'll get an answer for that very quickly. So Tom, one thing I wanted to ask you to see how the flow is going to go is we have work papers that show like where we got the 6.61 in other places. So I didn't know how you wanted to handle, like, do we want to go to those work papers for these conversations, or right now are we still keeping it high level so you have an understanding of what we're demonstrating?
You've read my mind. We're going to go there in just a minute.
Okay.
So you'll definitely have a
Okay.
chance to explain with reference to those. But for now, I'm just trying to understand the import of what
Yeah.
that 6.61% means.
Okay, so the little bird reminded me that it's a 6.61% reduction of ignitions in tier 3. And an ignition, the way we define an ignition is a reportable ignition. Again, and that's started it with associated SDG&E equipment and traveled a meter more than a meter away from our system. So that's the lore. When we talk about lore, we're talking about those ignition events. So a 6.61% reduction would be in tier 3. There is a sort of a historical average of how many ignitions we get in tier 3. And if we do this work in the future, because of it, that number will be 6.6% lower.
Okay, and that's the result of the scope of covered conductor work that you're proposing in the period covered by that SDG&E says is covered by this ramp, which is a 3-year period, 2022 to 2024. We don't agree with the period, but we'll put that aside and we'll just say, that's the period you're using. And,
well, Tom, if I could add, it's a consequence of the scope and also the effectiveness that we've implied from the covered conductor work itself.
Got it. And we will get into that in a minute. So I looked at your the units tables in the back of your wildfire chapter, and I know there's a range given, but it looks like for that 3-year period that you're covering in your ramp report, it's about 200 miles of work that's being proposed for that 3-year period in tier 3. Is that
roughly? Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So 200 miles of covered conductor work gets us a 6.61% reduction in the lure, which is really that's where the entire risk, almost all the risk reduction is coming from. So that gets us 6.61% reduction in risk for tier 3.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So now let's go down to row 25.
Just a quick correction. I think the total 200 is for both tier 2 and 3.
I got about
60.
Right? I got about 50 miles for tier 2 when I looked at the units table.
Oh, got it. Okay, I see. Yep.
So 200 miles I have about. I mean, I know there's a range, but I got about 200 miles. The 200 is about the midpoint of the range, and 50.
Yep.
That was tier 3, and about 50 more miles for tier 2 is what I saw.
Got it. You're good.
Okay. All right. So now if you could go to line 25, row 25, which I think you've done. So there we see a 57.6% change in wildfire lore for strategic undergrounding. Hope everybody sees that. And so then, if I'm understanding that, well, first of all, I think what I saw, again, looking at the units table from the wildfire chapter, there's a plan to do about 225 miles of strategic undergrounding over the 3-year period. Does that sound about right, Mason?
I would say approximately. I don't have the exact number in front of me. That would be in the work papers. Sarah would chime in if it was too much different from that.
All right. Well, unless someone, and these are just ballpark numbers, but
yeah.
So the import of that number then would be that by undergrounding 225 out of the approximately 1,650 tier 3 miles that we just talked about a moment ago, that's the overhead distribution miles. you are able to reduce the likelihood of a reportable ignition in all of Tier 3 by that 57.6% number.
That's what we're saying, yes.
Okay. To me, that tells me that the risk is very concentrated, because you can do 225 out of 1,650 or 1,700 miles, and you can get 60% of the risk taken care of. Is that a fair inference to draw from that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, roughly speaking, the worst circuits are quite a bit worse than the medium level circuits. So you could call it clumpy or peaky, or I forget the word you used, but concentrated, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. So now, I do want to start getting into how you got these percent change in wildfire lower numbers in column O. So that takes us to I think it takes us to the risk scoring work paper tab. Is that right? Oh, no, that takes us to a different work paper, right?
Correct.
Yeah. That would be the one that it's the final 2021 RSE work paper, right?
Yes, I believe so. Now, with my limited Cisco skills to switch, I'm going to do a stop share and then try to restart the share, and hopefully things don't fall apart. Oh, that just brought it back up to the same one. Okay, bear with me, sorry.
No problem.
Hi, this is Wendy. I'm wondering if you might send the document out because I'm going back to the original document. I'm having a very hard time to see it through the WebEx clearly, and I'm going back to the document.
Wendy, we sent that out. Joe, can you remind us when that was sent out?
Okay. So this is one that you already sent out. Got it. As long as that's the case.
Yeah, Wendy, you were not on the email that I sent out.
I had Fred forward it to me already, so I do have it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So can people see the final 2021 RSE work paper file?
Yes, it's up.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Well, it's up, but it's not quite readable. If you could.
Oh yeah, zoom in, make it
okay.
bigger,
All right.
maximize and zoom in.
Yeah. Maximize. It's fully maximized on my screen. I can zoom in.
I think if you zoom in, it should be okay.
Yeah. I'll worry about that when we get to the proper tab. Let me see, which ID are we shooting for here?
Thank you, Mason. So if we could start with C7M2-T1, that's covered conductor.
Okay, there we go. Now I'll do the zooming and you all let me know. Is that legible?
Looks good from here.
Okay.
All right. So great. Thank you. So just by reference to the workshop we had on, what was it, Tuesday? A couple days ago. There we were looking at how you, for the gas risk, we were looking at how in that case, SoCal Gas calculated the impact of the mitigation, and there was the company was using what is referred to as a percent method, and multiplying those 3 different percents for 3 different components of the impact of the mitigation.
Correct.
That's not how you did it for the wildfire, right?
Correct. We didn't use that method for wildfire. Okay.
All right. So let's start looking at how you did do it. So we were looking a moment ago at, and I'm not asking you to change work papers, but I think hopefully people have held in their mind that the number for the percent change in lure from that work paper was 6.61%. And also so the question is, how did you get to 6? And I think this work paper is supposed to show us how you got there, but I don't see this. I don't see 6.61% on this, and so need help in understanding how we go from here to 6.61%.
Okay, good question, Tom. And I was going to make a joke and just add it in over here to try to be funny, but what it is the wildfire. If you look down here, and I hope people can see the screen, and if not, please feedback. I'm doing my best. C23 on the tab that we're looking at says the number 477.99. What that represents is the wildfire risk reduction from this activity. Okay, and then if you compare the original wildfire risk score for tier 3, this is a 6.6% portion of it. And now that you've said it the way you've said it, I realize that's not on here, and I can understand how that would be a little bit hard to follow, but that's the math. So if you took the tier 3 wildfire risk score and you took 477 out of it, or actually it's basically 478, isn't it? If you took 478 out of it, that would be a 6.6% reduction.
And what was the original wildfire risk score?
Well, I'd have to go back to the other document, which I can do. When I do this, can you see my whole screen? Like, can you see the Excel underneath? Like, is it sharing my screen or just the document? Can anybody chime in on that one?
Yeah, we see multiple spreadsheets open behind it.
Okay. So the pre-mitigated risk score for wildfire risk for tier 3 is 7,229.61.
Where are you getting that from?
Oh, sorry, I thought you could see it. It's right here. It's in the risk scoring work paper. It's actually the first file we were looking at, Tom, which is called Final 2021 Work Paper, and it doesn't have the word RSE. And when we first started talking, we were looking at the summary, and that's where we highlighted the rows of interest to you. In the tab right over, it gives you the wildfire risk tier 3 breakdown, and the pre-mitigated score is 7,229.61. And then if you have that number available to you, and then you go back to the work paper, the 477 is 6.6% of that score.
Okay.
Essentially saying, we've moved the tier 3 wildfire risk score down by 478 points, which is 6.6% of the original wildfire risk score in tier 3.
So now what we're going to try to figure out is how we got to this 477.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume all of this information is here because it's been being used to generate that number.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so the first line, and I'm looking at column C, first row of numbers is 9.24 out there.
That's correct.
All right, that's the faults per 100 miles before hardening. That over a particular time period? It doesn't. What does that 9.24 mean, and where is it from?
That's the number of faults per mile in our system on non-covered conductor. So would you like me to kind of walk us to how we got to the 478?
No, well, I want to ask this question. I want to know.
Okay.
I don't see a source of that. And what time period are we talking about?
That's actually a question for Sean. If you want to put in the chat, Sean, what the time frame was, and I'll say that. But yeah, this was some work that was done. Not all of our work is done in every work paper. There's information that leads into other information. And somewhere along the line, we looked at outage data and some other data, and we can get the time frame from you. But essentially what we're doing is we're looking at how many faults there were on the system with non-covered conductor, and then after you put covered conductor, how many faults that you'll have afterwards, and then we're doing some math on that difference for the scope and for the miles that we were talking about.
Okay, well, it makes a difference as we go down these rows. So it helps to know what time period we're talking about, because we'll see.
Hey,
So
Mason, it's there in the title. It's a historical 5-year average.
well, no, that's the third. It says in the third row. That's where it says, but it doesn't say that for row 5.
Oh, I see, Sean. Okay, the 5-year average. There you go.
Yeah, but did you hear me? It doesn't say that for row 5.
Yeah, but
That
Sean,
is the,
yeah.
sorry, that is the faults per 100 miles. So we're using our number of faults in tier 3 and normalizing that across per 100 miles of overhead conductor in tier 3.
Over what time period? What did
Five 5 years, Tom. We said that just now. 5 years.
All right. The reason it doesn't say that on the worksheet. It says on this. It says.
Yeah, so
for
it's
row
5
7.
years. There's going to be lots of questions like that where we can't guess every single concern. So if that's what the answer is for this one, I'm sure we'll come across other questions that you have and we'll help you answer those.
Okay.
Can you say the specific years?
I'll defer to Sean on the specific years.
I'd have to double check. I believe it's 15 through 19.
All right, and is that for the entire system then? Is that what you said?
That's for tier 3 faults in tier 3 on non-covered conductor lines.
So 9.24 is for tier 3.
Correct.
Joseph Mitchell from Mussey Grade, is that, I still do want to just verify, this is number of faults per year over 5 years, or is it total number in 5 years?
It's the total number of faults per 100 miles per year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so then you skip down to row 8. We get this number 9.24 gets, I'm just going to use the phrase grossed up, sort of. It gets enhanced by a factor, and the factor seems to be derived by looking at from rows 6 and 7. So what is row 6? 293.75. What total faults HFTD? Is that for per year? What are we talking about there?
So you're asking for what 8 is all about?
6 row total faults HFTD 293.75. What is that?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, that's the number of faults over the 5-year average, I believe.
Well, so the next row says historical 5-year average faults HFTD. So what's different between those two rows?
Right. Christine, can you help me out with that one again?
I'm wondering if it's not per 100 miles. Is that a possibility, Mason? But rather the total faults in the tier area?
Yeah. Bear with us. You know, we had a lot of folks contributing to this file, and in the end, I'm not sure exactly which of those two were used in the math. So I guess, Tom, while we're trying to get to the answer to that, are you interested in every line here in the workbook? Or are you more interested in how we got to the 478? Because those might be slightly different answers, and I think there's context maybe we can add.
Well, I've worked through this and with the help of my team, and we know how the arithmetic works, but we want to understand why you did. Like, I'm trying to understand why you grossed up 9.24 to 12.93 using the comparison of rows 7 and 6 to derive an enhancement factor. I'm trying to understand why you did that, because it's different from what you have in your wildfire mitigation plan.
Okay, I think I understand your question, and I'm going to let other people on the call who are listening who we're responsible for 7 and 8 to contribute an answer to that. While we're waiting for that, I'd like to add, I want to make sure that you understand that there's a difference between the 22 work and the 23 and 24 work, and that's why they show up in 2 different locations, and then we add them together at the end. I know we're going to get to that.
Yeah, we definitely want to look at that a little bit, and we know this is being used to derive 22.
Tom, do you mind if I ask a question in between? I think it's related, and maybe there might be a general answer or just about the faults themselves.
Sure.
Thank you. So Mason, I didn't catch everything. You said the faults were from outage data, and what was it else? What else?
This one is from outage data for these faults. They are, yeah. I was thinking ahead for the another piece of data, but this is from outage data. All of our outages are recorded, and we know where they occur and how often they occur, and so we did an extract from that data.
So there's no other source.
Not that I know of from outage data. No.
All right, so
sorry, to follow up with that, what we did in the analysis was we later said what is the likelihood of an ignition occurring if a fault were to occur, and so everything is kind of wrapped around faults. There are obviously other risk events that occur to our system besides faults and ignitions, but we focused on faults, and then we mapped that to ignitions throughout this spreadsheet.
All right, while your folks are trying to help us figure out what's going on with rows 6 and 7 and why that's being used to gross up the 9.24. Let's look at row 10 is an important number for at least for 2022, which is the 70% effectiveness figure there. That's a value that's just a plug value. So that's something that was just determined. I assume that's subject matter expertise.
Well, I would say it's a combination of subject matter expertise and data, and I think Sean is planning on talking about that in a little bit. I don't know if we want to talk about that now.
Hey, yeah. Can I jump in here for a second, Mason?
Sure.
Yeah. So the what you're looking at with the before hardening with row 6, the total faults in the HFTD, that is our known faults with cause codes. So these are things that the system tripped, and we know why. If you look at the historical average, the 411 number in row 7, that is the total number of faults that happened, including undetermined faults that occurred. And so we don't want to not include the undetermined items because we know they caused a fault on the system, and something happened, something tripped, something operated, even if we don't know why or what the exact cause was. And so we increased that 9.24 to reach the extrapolated number, if you will, to include undetermined outages.
Undetermined outages. Okay. You said undetermined. You mean undetermined faults or outages? Same thing?
Same thing.
And 293 and 411 are those annual numbers?
Those are average per year.
Okay. So that means the before hardening number was of 9.24. That was
only looking at the known
causes.
Known causes. All right.
Thanks, Sean, for reminding me. It's hard to keep track of all the details on each of these sheets.
I know. I have to keep going back to my files as well. So, but yeah.
So this is Eric from Turn. So is 411
all faults or only unknown or only undetermined?
All.
So if 411 is all, why not just start with that number?
There are
It doesn't
certain
matter. Yeah.
items. Yeah. So yeah, I have to go back into the study again. We filtered out certain items to things like de-energizing them for safety reasons, things that aren't true faults. We had to filter out a lot of those items, and then for our, I guess, kind of our own purposes, we have it split out for the determined and then the total.
Yeah, I'll add, Eric, that what we're looking at here, it actually is a work paper that we used to some extent while we were working on this, and I believe there was a version where we didn't include the undetermineds, and then later we did, and so you might see kind of vestigial things, and that's kind of why I was asking Tom, like, are we interested in every line, or are we just kind of interested in which cells drive towards the important lines? Because those are two different things, and I think, Eric, your question is spot on, that they are two different things. So
they all drive. We established at the beginning they're here for a reason. They all drive toward the number, and so
no, sorry, Tom, they actually don't. So the 9.24, the 293 are not directly related to the final number. The 411 and the 12.93 are. So I think we should just keep in mind that not every single item on here drives towards the RSE contribution. These are work papers that have information that are not all pointing to the end result.
All right, let's keep going, Mason, okay? 70% is what drives the reduction to 3.88, right?
Correct.
Okay, 70%. Where's that from?
Sean, that's you.
Yep. So this was based on our subject matter expert analysis. They looked at the risk drivers that cause ignitions. I think that's table 7.2 in our wildfire mitigation plan. We have a list of all the drivers. They determined if we installed covered conductor, what types of reduction could you expect from installing covered conductor, and then averaged that out amongst those fault types to get to that effectiveness.
Okay. So I've seen two other covered conductor effectiveness numbers in two other places, and they're both lower than the 70%. One is in your wildfire mitigation plan, which you've just referenced, page 58, shows the faults decreasing, and the number that you used there was 9.24, not this grossed up number to 12.93. 9.24 miles to 4.92, which is a 47% reduction from in faults from covered conductor. So am I right that in your WMP you said it was a 47% impact, not 70?
I don't think so. I think the 47% was for the traditional overhead hardening and not for the covered conductor. The bare wire overhead hardening was 47%.
I'll try to look at that in a moment. We can verify that. And then the other place is the data request response. In this case, data request response 6-1E gave a covered conductor effectiveness percentage of 62%. Why 62% there, and why 70% on this work paper?
Hey, Tom, this is Sarah from SDG&E. I do see that discrepancy now. That's something we're going to need to address.
Okay. All right. Okay, so then this was all this is how you derive the difference between the ignitions before of 30.35 to 0.11. That's a 70% reduction, right?
That's correct.
And then the ignitions reduced is just the subtraction 0.25. We take into account that this is applying to 49 miles, and that yields a wildfire. This is all for 2022, a reduction in the risk of 0.12. Is that right? And what number is that? What's the number that's being reduced by 0.12?
The ignitions, yeah. In tier 3.
Right, because it's by installing covered conductor, we're saying we're reducing 0.25 ignitions per 100 miles, and we're installing 49.2 miles. So basically you cut it in half. You go from 0.25 to 0.12 actual ignitions.
Right. And then, okay, so let's see, okay, got it, thank you. So the pre-LOR wildfire risk is 5.13, and then the wildfire risk reduction, this is row 21, is 171.67. So those are the wildfire risk reduction is the total risk score. That's not
correct.
the LOR. Yeah, okay.
Correct. It's the 0.12 multiplied by the core.
Okay.
Gives you 171.
Okay. All right. So as you mentioned earlier, Mason, that was all to derive all the stuff above here is pretty much to derive the 2022 number. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So 2023 and 2024 are a different story. That's generated from wings, and we'll get there in a minute.
Yeah.
But let's just now note that the risk score for 2020, the risk reduction in row 23 from the 2023-2024 is, I'm sorry, row 22 is 306. So that's, I see. So that's about it's 2 years. So that's about 2 times the risk reduction for 2020. Okay. I see that. Okay. I wanted to start, I'm ready to move to the wings work paper, but before you do that, I wanted to give Eric or Jonathan a chance to ask any questions before we leave this work paper, although I'm sure we may need to come back. Eric, or I'm sorry.
I don't have any others on this one.
What's that?
I don't have any others on this one.
Okay. And I think I think we were hoping Chuck would be on. I don't know if Eric got any very, is Chuck on or is?
I'm on, Tom.
Okay, good. Okay, great. Okay. All right. So let's now go to the wings work paper.
Before we move off this paper, do you mind if I ask a quick question, Tom? I don't want to eat too much into your time, but
yeah, hopefully really quick. That would be great.
I really appreciated the discussion about units, and what I would just say is what would be really helpful, I think for me, would be for each one of these rows to explain specifically what the unit is. Like if the unit is, an annual number, an average, a fault per 100 miles, whether the fault includes faults that you have causes for or faults that you don't have causes for. Even the last thing that Tom was just discussing, wildfire risk reduction 2023 to 2024, that is for the years 2023 and 2024. And including, like, for example, if it's averaged over 5 years, like the Wendy's question before, if it had a note of these 5 years or whatever. All I'm saying is that if there were an opportunity at some point to have very specific clarity on which of these units are, what these exact units are, I think that would be very helpful for me to kind of understand it. But just a request at some point. So
Yeah, I agree. And this conversation highlights that, sometimes you put the document and we understand what it means when we did it, but when we show it to other people, I think you're exactly right, Chris, and we'll work on, I don't know how we'll go about updating it, but we'll work with the case management team to see what we can do.
Tom, do you mind if I ask one quick question too?
Great. Go ahead, sure.
The covered conductor effectiveness, Mason, and others at 70%. Is that largely because with the covered conductor, you still are going to you still know that you will have faults that will be difficult to detect, particularly like if a tree falls on it for a long time or something like that. Can you speak to that somewhat?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sean's more of an expert on that. I'll let him go on that one.
Yeah, I can. So we looked at the risk drivers to look at what would and would not be mitigated by covered conductor. So covered conductor is rated for incidental contact. So we assume most, if not all, small like mylar balloon contacts. I think 90% sort of reduction in faults. Minor branch or vegetation contacts, things like that are mitigated. But the larger items, an entire tree branch falls on the line, not mitigated. Car pole contact, causing the pole itself to fail, not mitigated. So we actually stepped through the drivers kind of step by step to look at how it would be reduced in that in those ways.
Sean,
those are just some examples off the top of my head. Yeah.
Is there any data backing that up for these estimates, or are these just sort of best guesses?
So it is best guesses from our subject matter experts. For right now, we do plan to continue to study it and use our actuals from the field. But given the fact that I think we're only up around 5 miles of covered conductor installed in our system right now, we don't have a lot of the actual data to use just yet for these sorts of studies.
Can you use
the one thing I'll add, sorry, real quick, I'll just add to that we do have a reference point from our traditional hardening or bare conductor hardening. So we've studied that and we've seen a 47% reduction. So we felt as SMEs that it is reasonable to assume that we'll get a little bit more. We don't know exactly how much more because we're still studying it. But I think the 47% is a reference point that is data driven and is based on some of our efficacy studies.
Yeah, that's right. So we know from our efficacy studies that the bare conductor hardening is 47%. Undergrounding is up near 99%. We knew we'd be within those bands. We did have some SME level discussions. We did talk to the other utilities and continue to do so to rectify these numbers. I believe they were in the similar ballpark, but there's no operational data to sort of back that number up.
You know, if other utilities like, for example, Edison has more data that you can access?
We were ordered after our 2021 wildfire mitigation plans to start a joint IOU study for the IOUs to come together and study the effectiveness of covered conductor and true this number up. We're starting that process, and we are going to be using other utility data to help with this, but I don't have anything final on that right now or any updates to it just yet.
And I will add that we're taking the perspective that right now we think it's this. As you can see, these are just numbers that can be replaced. So when we do that study and we feel good with it, if it comes back with a different number, we can plug that in, and all future work will have that number. So this is, I don't want you to think that this is the permanent number for this RSC showing. It is, because this is the best knowledge we had at the time. But we're certainly continuing to adapt and update our models as we go.
Can I ask one other on this? Oh, go ahead.
Just quickly, Sarah, would it be fair to characterize this estimate as conservative in that it's coming in? I'm kind of surprised it's this low considering the number of different contact methods and, sort of the scenarios that would have to come into play before you would actually get a fault from a covered conductor. So or do you think this is sort of the 70% is sort of mid-range of what you would guess, or is it sort of the lower limit of you're pretty sure that it's better than 70%?
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
I would say
Go
it's
ahead,
too
Sean.
soon to. I would say it's too soon to tell. If you look at all of our ignition drivers, like I was mentioning before, it will reduce a lot of the contacts. It's certainly not going to help reduce equipment failures, right? The equipment's going to fail on the line. It's going to fail on the line. Vehicle contacts, like I mentioned before, are a pretty large driver for us, and we don't feel it's going to, really mitigate that. It's hard to say what it's going to do with some of the unknown faults and things, but yeah, I would say it's certainly too soon to tell. I don't think it's a bad guess for now, based on what we know about the types of faults and the types of ignition drivers we have on our system. But I certainly wouldn't want to put any bands on it in either up or down.
Ask quickly, is that 70% based upon how many miles of covered conductor installed at this point?
No. The 70% effectiveness is not based on operational data. Again, we only have about 4 miles on our system, 5 miles or so right now. So it's basically subject matter expert input, looking at our ignition drivers and applying an effectiveness to each one of those ignition drivers.
Yeah, Chris, where we take the amount of miles we're mitigating into account goes in the final calculation of the wildfire risk reduction. So it's really looking at how many miles out of the total miles that are at risk, multiplying it by the effectiveness and other factors. So it's there in the risk reduction. It's just the effectiveness is agnostic to the mileage. And same goes for the other mitigations. There's an effectiveness value, and then there's the exposure and how much we're limiting that exposure. Does that help or make sense? Mason, please chime in.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, thank you. I'm still trying to get up to speed on it, but thank you. I appreciate that.
So to drill down, I know this seems like a pretty interesting topic, but so when we look, when Sean's talking about drivers, what we're saying is, X amount of faults came from trees, X amount came from vehicle contact, and so on and so on. We have, I think SDG&E has really good data of where the fault came from. And then we had the experts go through, like, how would this help? And because we know the input counts of how many actually recurred, we can do sort of a weighted average of the effectiveness from that. I've worked on it myself. Sean's worked on it separately. We're all kind of circling around the same number. This is a linear input. So if you changed 70 and made it 10% larger, you would have a 10% change in the risk reduction. So it is sensitive to changes, and we do want to get a really good number. I think it's in the ballpark. I wouldn't stand behind it if it wasn't. I think it's definitely in the ballpark. It's certainly in the same ballpark as the other utilities as well. But again, we're going to keep on getting better information and trying to improve it as we go.
So one last question on that, Mason. So
Sure, Wendy.
I know that in the power engineering world that there is an acknowledgement that the covered conductors, there can be faults that are difficult to, that's being worked on, perhaps, to come up with, new protection schemes. So in the future, how do you deal with that when, okay, you might install a covered conductor, but you're going to also need a new protection scheme in order to detect, more of the faults? How would you deal with that?
I'll let Sean chime in on that one too.
Yeah, that's a question for our system protection engineers. They're working on that, and unfortunately, they're not here right now, and I don't feel comfortable venturing guesses into the exact sorts of things that they're working on. Just that they're working on it.
In the interest of time, and just recognizing that the lead intent of this workshop is to really help the Turn team, maybe that question is out of scope and we can address it in a different workshop or a different or some other arena. So maybe we can go back to Turn's questions and just make sure we can address them
But yeah, I am going to keep going if that's all right. I would, before we leave this worksheet, let's just note that the wildfire risk reduction for 2023 and 2024 is 306.31. That's the number we want to understand how you got, because it's shown as a result generated from WINGS. We want
Correct.
to understand how you got that number from the WINGS work paper. So,
Okay.
Yeah, that's, and you know, we can even do that on an open-ended basis, Mason, if you'd prefer. If we could go to the WINGS work paper now, and then if you could help me
Okay.
and how you got that number, that would be helpful.
All right. Again, bear with me with my abilities to change. Let's see here. I had it open, so let me just find it. Sarah, in the chat, can you tell me, is it, we talk about DR6 or DR5 is the one that you'd like to go to?
The response to DR6, please. That has the updated one.
Okay. All right. I think I've got it. Let me continue sharing. There we go. Okay, this is the WINGS for DR6. I think here, let's see, what's the right way to look at this? Actually, let me pause here a second. I know Tom's trying to dive down into the, I think it was 336.31, Tom.
306.31.
Oh, I got it wrong. I missed the number. Can let's see, what's the most effective way to do that? Because this sheet has a combination of underground and overhead and some nothing. So I want to make sure that we're getting the right values.
And that's indeed one of our problems, is that we haven't seen it segregated by different type of mitigation.
Okay. Let's see here. I'm asking my team what's the easiest way to drill down into the number that you asked for. So bear with us for a second.
So maybe let's just answer the big picture of how WINGS data went into the program level risk spend efficiency. Would that help, Tom, as a start?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Sarah?
I was just saying maybe we start with the big picture of explaining how this level of WINGS data fed into the overall program risk spend efficiency as a start, and then we can dive into it a little bit more. Would that help?
I hope so.
Okay. So in the WINGS spreadsheet, we did our best guess to figure out where we think covered the targeted miles for covered conductor or undergrounding are going to go on which segments, how much of those segments would be mitigated. Granted, that changes as we speak, as we're scoping circuits, but it's still representative of our approach in general. So we went into WINGS and we allocated the miles across the segments, typically targeting higher risk miles specifically for underground and covered conductor. And we then aggregated, so Mason, if you, and we can't really see it here, but if you look at the segments that have covered conductor assigned to them, they have a risk reduction estimate based on how much covered conductor we're going to implement on those segments, based on the effectiveness of covered conductor that we're assuming. And that leads to the post-mitigation risk points, the wildfire risk points after the mitigation, or in other terms, the total wildfire risk reduction from covered conductor. What we then did is we added up these points across the segments that are getting the covered conductor. So we looked at the segments, we said, okay, which ones are getting covered conductor? How much wildfire risk reduction are we getting from each one? We added that up and then we plugged it back into the overall assessment in the other work paper that we were looking at that shows 2023 through 2024. That's kind of the big picture, is we took this granular information from WINGS and then added it up and aggregated it to the program level risk spend efficiency. Let me just pause here and see if that made sense just from a bigger picture standpoint.
Well, Eric, feel free to jump in, but so to get to that 306.31 number, you're saying it should be the sum of, in column M, the risk reduction points for anything that shows covered conductor?
It would be column K.
Yeah. So
Okay.
let me, Chris,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry, I was looking at the present value. Yeah, okay.
So let me walk through here a little bit, Sarah. I almost called you Christine. All the ones in column K that have covered conductor for their solution, if you add those up, you get Tom, do you remember in the way we did the ramp, we multiply for readability purposes. We multiplied things by 100,000 to make them more readable. So this is the kind of before that occurs. But if you add up the covered conductor elements that are shown in this here, you should get near 306. And the reason I say near is because this version right here, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, maybe we want to reiterate that there's already been a little bit of update to some inputs and some understanding about the circuits that we've looked at. And so these numbers might not match exactly, but that's the idea, is that you would look at K, you would see where there was covered conductor as a solution, add those up, and then get the 100,000 multiplier in there. And that should give you at least the sentiment of where the 306 came from at the time.
Eric, or Eric, does that prompt any other questions from you? I guess it's something we can't know if it works until we try it. Have you guys done that?
I can try it and let you know if it works. I was wondering if we could even just take a step back and, I mean, have you gone over, Mason, like we have these really granular wildfire risk scores, right? Even starting in column D. And I'm wondering if maybe I've missed it. Is there a work paper that shows how we got to these? Or, and Tom, let me know, I don't want to get you off track, but I was hoping at some point we could go over even those calculations as well. But let me know if you think you've already covered it and I'm just like not.
No, we haven't covered it, Eric. And in fact, this is like a sample. This is a piece of the WINGS database, or not database, but the WINGS spreadsheet. And this is as much of it as we've presented at this time. There's a lot that kind of goes into how we got D, E, and F, and I think we've had discussions about how far down that data is available. It's changing all the time, and we have these issues about trying to remember what we said 6 months ago while we're still trying to update things. So there's some of that going on. So I'll pause. And does anybody from case management want to address Eric's question? I think it's an important one.
No, this is Sarah. I'll chime in. We haven't provided additional work papers to guide that, but we can talk about how those numbers are assigned, big picture. Basically, we have our fire risk assessment across the system, and we have it across the HFTD, for example. We basically assign, I'm going to use incorrect terms probably, but just to help explain it. We take that big risk number, if you will, and we allocate it to the segments to say, well, how much of it exists in segment A versus B versus Z? And that's really based on the segment's length, how much it's got overhead exposure, how many tree strike potentials there could be on that segment, what the wind speeds are at that segment. So it's really kind of allocating that big chunk of the risk to these segments tailored to their unique characteristics and conditions. I'll just say that. So it in general, if you look at the entirety of the WINGS model, it adds up to the total fire risk score that you're looking at in the ramp.
Okay, and well, could you go maybe one level up? You said you take the larger circuit number and allocate it out. So then how do you get the larger circuit number?
I was saying the larger total fire risk across the system. So what you've seen in the ramp is the big picture assessment of what is the fire risk that we see in our system today, given everything that we're doing. That's what I'm talking about as kind of a way for us to calibrate and figure out how to allocate the risk across the segments.
Yeah, and I mean like, so for circuit ID 222, you have a risk of 0.016. So, and I think you were saying you take that 0.016 and then allocate that out to the sub circuit. So I was curious about the 0.016.
So the 0.016 is a summation of the segments that comprise that circuit. That's what Mason is highlighting there. So every single, we have how many? 8 segments in total. Each one has a wildfire risk score. So the big picture allocation really happens at the segment level, and then we add up what the circuit score looks like.
So Eric, I'll add to that. We looked at the top down for 2020, 2021. Our wildfire system model is a top down model. We think we know what the wildfire risk is at the system level. And it's roughly a large fire once every 15 years of a significant damage, somewhere in the $1 to $3 billion range. That's what our modeling says. And then what we do is we take that chunk and we allocate it to the segments based upon what Sarah was kind of reading out, which is like the length of the segment, how many trees are nearby, what kind of wind is there, is it hardened? I know you guys are sick of me saying this, but that's what we've done right now. In the future, and not too far away, we're going to start doing more bottoms up, where we look at the granular and kind of feed it up from the bottom. But right now we have kind of a top down allocation method based upon about 4 things: wind speed, hardening, vegetation, and I think there's one other thing I can't remember right now.
Mason, when you were just describing that top down, are you saying that's how WINGS works, or I thought WINGS was more bottoms up?
Yeah, WINGS is a bottoms up, but it uses as its risk starting point the chunk of wildfire risk that's allocated from the system. Basically, what we did is we looked at kind of I'll describe it as for currently, and actually it's already sort of historical, but the way we did it for this was we looked at the sort of relative ranking of risk for all those in a quantitative way, and then we turned the dials so they added up to the overall system risk. So it's kind of like an in-between bottoms up and top down. In the future, we'd like to go almost exclusively from bottoms up. We're not quite there yet. And I know this is kind of like wonky stuff. Am I explaining myself clearly, or do I need to do another run at that?
It's interesting, Mason. It's something I hadn't quite appreciated. I don't know if Eric had, but so that means that Eric was looking at circuit 222, the one at the top, and the wildfire risk score is 0.17 in the aggregate. And as Sarah explained, that 0.17 is just the summation of the segment scores below that.
Correct.
But that 0.17 is derived from an allocation. It's that score and all the others that are shown in this work paper are an allocation that is designed that apportions the risk across the system to get to the overall system
Correct
risk score.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure I quite appreciated that, so that's actually good to know.
I didn't either. I thought it was bottoms up, so I'm very glad I asked.
No.
And Tom, keep going.
We're happy to clarify.
Tom, go with yours. I mean, I also kind of want to ask the same thing about PSPS risk, but I know you had other questions. So
yeah, before we get to the PSPS risk, I wanted to well, as I was thinking about the answer that we can get to that magic 306 number we were talking about earlier for 2023, 2024 risk reduction. from this spreadsheet, but I don't think we can because that was for tier 3. And this spreadsheet does not differentiate between tier 3 and tier 2. Unless I'm missing something.
No, I think you're right on that. I need to remember if these are exclusively tier 3 though.
Yeah, we'll have to check that, but it's this work paper doesn't differentiate between the 2 tiers.
So that would be something that would be helpful to add in a field.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. So Eric, before one thing I wanted to do, let me just sort of compare notes, Eric, and see which one we go to first. I wanted to let's see, how much time do we have? We have a little over half hour. And hopefully if there's a little bit of overflow, that would be nice. Eric, does your question relates to this work paper? I don't think I have other questions about this work paper at this point. So if you had questions on this one, I think you should go ahead with them.
Okay. I mean, yeah, let's see how far we can get. I think I basically had the same question as wildfire risk for the PSPS risk column. If you could just explain how you got those numbers, that would be helpful. Or tell me that I'm missing a work paper somewhere. That would also be helpful.
It's very analogous to the wildfire. It's a little bit of a twist, but it's essentially the same. So what we've done is in WINGS, we've looked at what we think is an estimate of how often customers currently get PSPS on that segment and how much they will get PSPS after different mitigations may be imposed. So, whether it's covered or underground. And then we do that at each segment level based upon wind speeds and our understanding of when we might be turning the power off for different mitigations. So, but that's like the first pass. That gives you a number. And then what we wanted to do was kind of, reality check that number. And so we kind of turn the dials again to get it closer to reality. It turns out that sometimes, we may have overestimated how often they got shut off or underestimated. So in the end, after we looked at it, if we just did it from WINGS, I think we would have had a much bigger PSPS impact. So what we did is we turned the dials down to make it match our understanding of the historical data. Again, in the future, we plan on doing it more at the segment level to do bottoms up specifically. But it's kind of hard to do that because history and looking forward, it's always good to kind of make sure you're not too far off. So pretty much the same story, Eric. I hope you followed the logic.
Well, sort of. So I get you started system level. I mean, so okay, risk is likelihood times consequence, right? So did you start with a likelihood of PSPS times consequence calculation?
Yeah, great question. So what we did was we said how many events will there be based upon our current understanding, and then that's like a 100% likelihood. So for example, if you say there's going to be 2 a year on a particular sorry, my fire alarm just went off.
Oh no.
Can you guys hear that, or is it just me?
Is everything okay? I can
hear you.
chime in, Mason, if you want to.
Yeah,
sure
why don't you take over while I mute?
Yes, safety first. So the big picture number, so total system PSPS risk is based on how many events do we think we're going to have. And that's looking backwards at how many PSPS events we've had every year, how many customers we've impacted. So the big picture, we kind of have a SAIDI number in mind that we know overall across the system how many PSPS outages we've had, how long they've been. At the segment level, we do an assessment, as Mason was alluding to say, what is the probability of shutting off this particular segment, given its conditions, its wind speed, vegetation risk, yada, yada, yada. What's the probability that it's going to get shut off before we do any mitigations to it, and then we estimate the probability that it's going to get shut off post mitigation. And generally speaking, with underground, the probability goes down to 0. We're not going to shut off that segment if it's underground. If it's covered conductor, there's a small reduction that we assume. Again, that remains to be tested and studied further. So that's the likelihood side of the equation for the segment level probability of PSPS. Also at the segment level, we capture how many customers downstream of the device that's operated for that segment are going to be impacted if we shut them off. So we have unique counts of customers for every segment, breakdown of the customer types that feeds into our customer PSPS valuation framework, and that gets aggregated into the total, the MAVF risk score for PSPS. So I hope that made sense, but again, feel free to ask any other questions.
Okay, and just that mostly made sense. Again, it was done first at a high level for all tier 3 and then all tier 2 PSPS, and then allocated down to the segment.
So there's a slightly different thing in PSPS. There's not necessarily an allocation, it's more of a calibration, because when we were doing things at a segment by segment, we were kind of, in a box thinking about each segment, but when we zoomed out and added everything up, we realized, hey, the total is overestimating the risk. In reality, we know from prior events, the big picture is X, and we calibrated the segments to match that big picture number. So it's a little bit of this bottom up, top down approach.
Okay.
Mason, I don't know
So
if you're
here you
back.
really started bottoms up in this case, and then adjusted bottoms up to top down.
Technically speaking, they're both bottoms up with a top down calibration.
Okay, well then I'm confused, because what I heard for wildfire risk was that you started with total risk top down and then allocated out to the segments, whereas PSPS, it sounded like you actually started with the segments and then looked at those values and then adjusted them based on the top down.
Yeah, both ways. We looked at what is the risk at each segment, and then we added it up and compared it to what the top-down view looked like and made adjustments. It doesn't really matter what the order was necessarily. We certainly didn't, like for wildfire, we didn't start with something and then allocate it in a vacuum. We looked at each segment in a proportional way, a relative way, and then we allocated it. So it's very similar. It's kind of a standard technique to get your numbers from a granular way to match the big way. Do it both directions, bottoms up and top down.
Okay. I think I mostly understand that. I'm wondering if Chuck had any follow-ons to those.
No, Eric, I don't. I understand what Mason said, and I think I understand what they're doing.
Cool. Yeah, I gotta. I think
Joe
my
Mitchell
only.
here. May I ask?
Joe. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how you collected the portfolio of circuits in this response. If I look at the overall risk per unit mile, it varies by about a factor of 20 for different circuits. So I'm just wondering, how did you actually select these particular circuits for inclusion in this mitigation segment?
Yeah, I'll start and then Sarah can wrap up. WINGS allows us to do at a segment level the wildfire and the PSPS assessment. What's the risk look like? How does it change if we do these mitigations? What's the RSE for each mitigation? And then we have the ability to say these ones are the ones we should be looking at. However, it's a little bit more complicated because some of the segments have sort of a shared PSPS impact, and there are other aspects to, is it practical to work on these segments right now? Some of them already have work ongoing, and there's a lot of real-time things to consider. So we took WINGS as a starting point, And then Sarah's team passed it off to another team, and together they landed on this list for a practical list of circuits that we could do work on in the time frame that is in the ramp in 2023, 2024 timeframe. I'll pause right there. Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with the big picture. So we've shared this, I think, in the first post-ramp workshop. Out of our distribution system in the HFTD, we've hardened about 26%. That means there's still a lot of miles out there that we think need to be evaluated, need to be mitigated. Not all of them necessarily, but there's still some things we need to prioritize. So when we were putting together the targets for the ramp, a lot of it is based on how much work can we realistically do every year. And that goes through our engineering teams, and we have a discussion and conversation about realistically we can do maybe 100 miles of covered conductor per year. So once those targets were set, so now we're looking at 2023-2024 window. We have a total of 200 covered conductor miles we think we can achieve. And we have an estimated total of 275 underground miles we think we can do in those 2 years. We then went into the WINGS model to say, okay, what are maybe the highest risk areas to start with, looking at them to try to allocate where those miles could go. But it's not just looking at the fire risk rank. We're looking at the risk spend efficiency. I wish I could sit here and tell you we have a specific cutoff. That's not necessarily the case. There's other factors that go into it. So we're looking at the risk reduction, we're looking at the risk spend efficiency from a relative standpoint, we're looking at potential for PSPS reduction, and then we're looking at also from a feasibility standpoint. So the model doesn't reflect everything in reality on how we do things, right? We do our best to put everything in the model, but it doesn't have everything. There still remains room for our engineers to look at the circuits to say, yeah, we think those circuits are reasonable to achieve or do something with. So basically, we allocated those targets across these segments based on where realistically we think some of the work might go. And that changes as we scope things. But as you can see, a lot of these segments are really high-ranking ones that we're proposing to do in the next few years. And there's still other segments that remain as high risk, and those will be slated for the next round. There's still a lot of work out there to do is what I'm trying to explain. And we just try to figure out how much can we do? Where do we start?
Thank you. So with regard to the undergrounding versus covered conductor, you said you can do
So you're cutting off a little bit. I don't know if it's just me.
Yeah, okay, I'll repeat. You said
Are others having a?
Yeah, I can't hear Joe. Sorry.
I will.
Yeah, I think others are confirming. So
yeah,
it's not my connection.
Can you write it in the chat, Joe?
Yeah, let's see if Joe can get squared away, and maybe I might ask a question / make a comment. To me, it seems like it would be really a few things that would make this work paper much more useful. One is to actually, I think, separate it into a few different work papers. One is to have a work paper. I think what would be good is to have a work paper by mitigation and by tier to match up with your other work papers, because I think there's sort of a mismatch in the work papers. So if we could have a tier 3 covered conductor, tier 3 underground, and tier 2 covered conductor and underground, that would be really helpful and help us see whether the numbers are matching up. And then the other thing, and it gets to the question that was asked at the beginning by someone from SPD, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name, about how do we, about this question of how was the scope chosen for these mitigations. And here we've been looking at covered conductor and undergrounding. And for that, it's not particularly useful to have a work paper that just shows us the work, the results for the segments and circuits where SDG&E is proposing to do the work. It's not that that's unhelpful. It is. It's fine, but it doesn't really help us get to the question of how, if we want to suggest a different scope, either smaller or larger, we don't have the information to do that. And so it seems like it would be helpful to have the information the way I just described it, broken out, or for the entire, for all of tier 3 and all of tier 2, as opposed to just where the selected circuits and segments where you're proposing to do work. So reactions to that from SDG&E?
Yeah, I will say that that is something we can do. It is very convoluted and complex because some segments will span both tiers. It'll just take us a little bit of time if you can be patient with us, but we can produce something like that breaks down this table basically, if I heard you correctly, into 4 tables by mitigation, by tier. So it'll be covered conductor tier 3, covered conductor tier 2, same thing with the underground.
Yeah, that's just to get these work papers to match up. And that's great, Sarah. I'm glad to hear that. And then the other part of my comment was, can we see that information for the entirety of the tiers as opposed to just the selected circuits and segments where SDG&E is proposing to do work?
So you're
Yes.
suggesting a list of all the circuits, not just the ones that are in this list? All the segments, I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the reason these are here, if I'm understanding correctly, because these are the ones where you're proposing to do something. Although there are some that, but the circuits where you're proposing to do something, there's some where you're not doing anything, and that. But every
Correct.
circuit here is one where you're doing at least one of the 2 mitigations, I think.
Yeah, I think, the way we understand what needs to be provided for ramp is what we're proposing in the ramp cycle. So we see it as being out of scope to share everything else we looked at. I think this is our proposal and our best estimate of where we think the work is going to go, and we'll update it accordingly in the GRC. But we don't think that it is in scope to include other areas we're not looking to mitigate potentially in the next 3 years, or in the ramp timeframe.
Well,
Tom, this is Joe. Again, just for some clarity, when Sarah mentioned that one of the inputs to identify, if you will, the scope of work, talked with the subject matter experts and what we thought was feasible with resources and other data points for the amount of work that we could do over the next couple of years. And so we, if you will, I think we then developed our forecast accordingly. By you saying you'd like to have all of our, I think, all of the segments, if you will, that's in the database, that is, as Sarah said, that is beyond just what we had in ramp. So again, just recognize that to the extent we pursue that, that is gathering data that we don't have relative to ramp. And then also, one of the concerns we have is that the feasibility of us doing work that could give the wrong impression of the type of work that we feel that we could actually do. Again, for purposes of ramp.
yeah.
Could you possibly clarify as to what came first, the calculation of the risk and the risk spend efficiencies, and then the feasibility selection, or was there a set that was selected for feasibility and only that was taken through this process?
It's the first one, Joe. We looked at everything, and we looked at RSEs for covered and underground for every segment available to us. And then, as Sarah said, we took that list and added some constraints to it and went from there.
And I think what Tom is asking for, and Tom can correct me, is just can we see that raw information with the selected pieces highlighted, and then maybe some explanation of why the other circuits, which may have very high RSEs or high risk, weren't selected for this round.
We'll have to, we've got the question noted down, and we'll consider that. Again, we have some concerns as we voiced, but we're not going to say no on this call. We recognize we're trying to provide the information that will provide helpful data points to everybody, but we need to evaluate that question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I was going to ask to go back to one of our previous work papers, but before I do, I wanted to see if anybody had questions, either from Turner or anybody else had questions before we leave the wings work paper.
So Tom, this is Mason. I'll just say, I know you were interested in the undergrounding as well. This is the same file. So it's going to be the same result. You know, we're going to go back and look at the underground work paper, and it's going to have a number. It's the exact same process of looking at column K and which ones have underground next to them. And so I just want to make sure you understood it's all right here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And you did read my mind. I did want to go to undergrounding a little bit. So if we could go to the...
I just want to ask about Joseph's question in the chat. I don't think it's been addressed.
I can't see the chat actually, Wendy. Could you read it?
Oh, really? Yeah. It says, to what extent are covered conductor and undergrounding capacity limited? So if there are 200 miles of each that are planned, could you shift to do 300 plus 100 or 100 plus 300? Are both of these programs at max capacity?
Could I take that one, Mason?
Please.
Yeah. So the scope and type of construction you're doing for covered conductor versus undergrounding are different. We are limited by the number of both internal crews we have and the number of contract crews we have. We could shift some of the miles around a little bit, but you do need quite a bit of advance notice on the order of at least a year or two, because undergrounding requires a whole different set of permits and designs that covered conductor may not, or that are significantly different from covered conductor. So when you're preparing your engineering designs, permitting, etc., ahead of time, you do need to know which one you're doing, and you can't quickly shift from one to the other in 1 year. It would have to be a planned shift several years out.
Thank you, Sean. Wendy, does that, oh, actually, that was Joe's question. Sorry.
Yeah, that was Joe's question.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right.
This is you invited if there was any other thing. The only other thing I would add is if Sarah, if you do provide the information that Tom was requesting, breaking things down into the tier 2, tier 3 stuff, or if you also gather the information, the granular information that Joe and Tom were talking about, we'd be, I think, along with everyone else, we'd be interested in being able to see that information as well. That's all I was going to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, this is
noted.
Joe. Yeah, just as a follow-up to what I had mentioned during Tuesday's phone call, to the extent we are providing spreadsheets, if you will, to one party based upon data requests, we are proactively providing them to everyone. We are unable, and sorry, Tom, we just haven't finalized our response to your question, but we are unable to post them to our RAMP website. And in lieu of that, if you will, on a real-time basis, the same day, next business day, we are providing any spreadsheets to a data request. We are providing them to all parties.
Well, since you brought that up, I was looking at your wildfire mitigation plan website where you have materials posted there, and I saw data request responses, including Excel attachments on that website. So it seems like you do have the capability to put Excel documents up on your website. anyway, take a look at that. Are we, it sounds like maybe we've exhausted questions. Thank you, Mason, or whoever who did this for going back to this worksheet, because that's where I wanted to go. Can we go to the undergrounding one for tier ones? That's C16, M11, T1, that tab. Okay, give me a moment here just to find my place in my notes. So there, actually, I'm going to go back to one of the previous work papers. You don't have to go back, but we had a risk reduction number. I guess the risk reduction number is 4164, which should equate to the 57.6%. Is that right? Do I have that right, Mason?
I'm sorry, say that again, Tom.
Well, remember way back when we saw that the risk reduction for tier 3 was going to be 57.6%.
Oh, for undergrounding, yes.
For undergrounding, yeah.
Yeah.
For tier 3. So, yeah. and this worksheet we're on now shows a wildfire risk reduction of 4164.
Correct.
So that must be 57% of the larger number.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So and we won't go through all the other stuff before. We've done that already. Wildfire risk reduction, rows 24 and 25. For 2022, from undergrounding, we get a pretty small slice of that total risk reduction. The overwhelming amount of the risk reduction is in 2023 and 2024. Is that because you're planning to do very little undergrounding in 2022 and do most of it in 2023 and 2024?
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with the units in the outer years. I don't have them in front of me. I could pull it up.
Somewhere I saw that you were
planning
50 miles in 2022. That made me wonder how many you were planning to do in 2023 and 2024.
Yeah, it ramps up from there. It's not, no, yeah. It goes up to, I have the, here, give me one moment. I'll pull up the exact units and chime back in to Mason.
Yeah, if you have it for 2022 and then 2023 and 2024, that'd be good. I just couldn't tell if there was something off here or whether it just is a matter of comparatively very little work being done in 2022. I wanted to go back to the first work paper we were looking at. So I don't know how long it's going to take you to get that.
Well, let me try to do a shortcut, see what happens.
Sure.
Is this the one, Tom?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I need to pull up on my screen too. So.
I know yellow's not the best color, but it was the first one I saw.
I like yellow. I think it's good. Right? This is a different question. I think I understand, but I just want to confirm that I'm understanding what's going on here. If we look at, this is just an example, and I mentioned we might look at this, rows 43 and 44, that's tree trimming.
There we go.
So the first time I looked at this and I looked at column O, the change in wildfire lore, I was struck by greater than 100% numbers, and I thought, wow, that's weird. But I think I'm sort of getting it, but I want to make sure I'm getting that right. So again, let me just catch where I am in my notes and then I'll.
It's a quick answer if you don't mind me just chiming in.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a control, and you can tell from the ID. So this particular activity is one that's currently being done, and the way it's described here is it will continue to be done the same way it is. There are a few other veg things that are maybe above and beyond this one that are more, going forward different, but this is just a control. And so the math here is if we stop doing it, what is the change in risk?
Yeah.
Which is to say it would rise pretty dramatically.
Right. Yeah, I flagged that because it took me a little while to understand it, but I did see that you described that in I think it's in chapter ramp C. So I think I get it. I'm a little bit concerned about a control where you do something different. I'm not quite sure how we deal with that situation. But
I'm sorry. What was that comment regarding?
Well, so the example you give in ramp C is where you're going to still do the control, but you're proposing to do it in a reduced scope or in a reduced manner. And so there what's being modeled is a control, not the elimination of the control, but the scaling back of the control. And so I'm not sure how if those are being well differentiated here.
Yeah, that doesn't apply to this one. In fact, I'm having a hard time remembering when we would alter a control in that way. I'm sure it's there somewhere, but yeah, this one is just do what we currently do or stop doing it is essentially what 43 and 44 are.
Right. If you go back and look at your ramp C, you'll see that it's a different example that you've given. It's not elimination of the control entirely. It's
oh, okay.
Scaling back of the control. And I thought, well, they're raising that as an example, and maybe that's something that happens sometimes. And so I'm not sure. It might need to be explained when that's happening. But I agree with you. It doesn't sound like that's what's happening with these tree trimming.
Yeah.
Controls or some of the other controls on it. There's a bunch of controls on it, and the way for us to differentiate between controls and mitigations on this spreadsheet is if it's not a mitigation, then it wouldn't have an M number, right, in the ID.
That's correct, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that because sometimes we at the company we call a control a program that's in place. And the activity that it's undertaking might be a new activity. So for example, if I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but imagine like if for reliability, if we're replacing underground cable with newer cable, there's a program called underground cable replacement, and we call it a control because it exists. But the next cable that we're going to ask for money for to replace is a different cable than we did last year. So it's not truly a control in the sense of it's currently in place. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it gets a little tricky with the wording. So how would you know the difference? I'm trying to figure out. Christine, is there a flag for in this where it's more obvious if it's going up or down, depending if you do it or not? I'll leave that out. If she has an answer for it, I'll let you know. Also, Tom, I did notice, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just looking at the clock. It's 2:58, and I think maybe it's time to sort of update what the plan is, if we could. And
could I just get a check in on the volumes of miles of work for undergrounding for 2022, 2023, 2024? Do we have an answer on that yet?
Sure. In 22, it's 22 miles. In 23.
Real quick, are you looking for totals or by tier?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, I guess I guess we're looking for tier 3 since that's where we were just looking at that worksheet for tier 3. So yeah, I guess we better do tier 3.
So are my numbers here in the text? Is that for tier 3? So,
I have the totals. Sean, do you
okay,
have
there you
the
go.
breakdown?
No, I just pulled the totals. I'll have to get the breakdown.
Okay.
What are the totals then, since you have that?
It's 25 for 2022. Okay.
This is Joe.
It's
If Sarah, I'll just help out. If when you look at the work papers that are posted to the RAMP website for the, I think it's what the tier, what's on the lower one there? The tier 2, the range in 22 is 27 to 33. The range is 40 and 23 is 42 to 52. And the range in 24 is 52 to 62. For tier 3, it's higher. In 22, it's 45 to 55. In 23, it's 70 to 85. And in 24, it's 85 to 105.
What work paper were you looking at, Joe?
On the SDG&E RAMP website, we have a work paper that has the recorded and forecast dollars on a year-by-year basis, 5-year historic and 3-year forecast. We have the dollars by year, by range, and then the units by year, by range as well.
Okay. Take a look at that. When you aggregate, so Joe, if you have those numbers in front of you, so if you just take the mid-range and just ballpark it, so what does it end up being for tier 3 for 2022? If you just take the middle of the ranges for, if you could do it year by year, I'd appreciate that.
Tier 3 is 50.
For 2022.
78.
Yeah, 50.
50. Yeah, 78. 90.
Okay, thank you. Mason, I know you want to do a check-in. I think that's most of my questions. I would pass to Eric and Chuck to see if they had questions.
Nothing else from me. Thanks, Tom.
This Chuck, I have only one question right now, and that is, have you given any thought to what you will do if you implement more than one mitigation?
Chuck, could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. I'm just wondering if there are situations where you will want to, in the same segment, implement more than one mitigation, and if that's the case, how will you calculate the net risk reduction?
So are you talking about like if we do underground and vegetation management on a segment?
For example.
Yeah, so those types of things get, I don't know that they're necessarily embedded in the risk scoring, but they do get addressed out in the field, and when our crews plan what needs to be done, and there's coordination that happens with our hardening team when they're planning things ahead of time. Mason, I don't know if you want to elaborate specifically on how risk scoring might be affected by those types of situations.
Yeah, right now we do that for the PSPS impact and system hardening, where we know we're going to be doing PSPS, and we try not to take credit for both things. But things like changing out right here, hotline clamps or expulsion fuse replacements, for example, it's very difficult to do that up front. There's a tracking system. Like if we know we're going to be doing system hardening on a circuit, we're not going to go in and change out equipment right before it and then do a system hardening. So from one perspective, it's pretty rare for that to happen. And like for PSPS, it does happen, and we're making some accommodations for that. But we've also looked at the system protection. We're trying to make some accommodations for advanced protection here, not taking credit for both system hardening and advanced protection. But a lot of these individual assets, it's kind of like it doesn't necessarily happen.
I understand. It's fair to conclude then that you don't have in place a method for doing that that's generally applicable.
It's not a general application, correct? When we go through with the team, what does this mitigation purport to do? we try to ask the question, does it overlap with other mitigations? And we kind of go from there. And most of the time, the answer is no, it doesn't, specifically with system hardening. Now, I can't promise you that we're going to replace, we might replace a fuse now, and then the next GRC, we might harden it, but that's, it's kind of unknowable at this point. We understand the concept of not trying to double count or to not understand the relationships, and we are having those conversations, but like, yeah, there's no general rule on how to address it. It's more understanding what that sort of the correlations or the covariances are between those two, and those would obviously be subject matter expert driven.
And one thing I will add, just generally speaking, I think those types of changes to how programs are implemented, I think would happen when we have bigger changes in the system, meaning if we start undergrounding a whole lot of miles, then we might see a shift in how much vegetation management we might need in certain areas, but that we're not at that point yet to be able to, you know, kind of look at those overlaps in a meaningful way. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's still, even with asset inspections, even when we underground, we still have to do those inspections on our pad mounts and other structures that support our underground system. So, you know, unless we see wholesale big changes to the system, those shifts don't happen as significantly.
I understand. Thank you very much for the answer.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good question that Charles asked, particularly because in my mind, there's still a lot to be looked at as far as how much could be done by, for example, advanced protection schemes versus, undergrounding versus covered conductor, or even, advanced protection schemes versus, covered conductor with some advanced protection schemes, those kind of comparisons. And I understand that this is all developing, but I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Wendy. And we really want to include that type of work. So in particular, we're trying to do some system protection that helps with a falling conductor. And if we have the right network in place, we'll be able to determine how to open up a fault before it hits the ground. That kind of stuff, we're totally looking into. Well, if we have that in place, in addition to hardening, that each one gives you benefit, but you can't just add those two together. We're really trying to think about that, and we haven't developed all that much material on how to do that quantitatively, but it's certainly part of the conversation, and we've included that in a few places already. We're certainly aware of its occurrence, and we're actually kind of using that to figure out where we should do projects. But it's hard to know all these kind of nuances and interrelationships with each mitigation to some extent.
Yeah, exactly. And just to emphasize that last point that Mason made, it's just because we don't include it in the upfront quantifications that are sort of a forecast or where we think things are going to happen, doesn't mean we don't take it into consideration. Our engineering teams, when they're scoping all these hardening projects, they're looking at everything. Whether new sectionalizing is going to go into segments, is it going to change whether we do undergrounding in a certain area or not, microgrids. So it's hard to put it all in these numbers, but we do look at it meaningfully when we're scoping with our teams and look across different functions to take those things into account.
This is Chris. If I could just touch base on that one subject. I mean, that, Mason, I believe you mentioned using that technology in addition to other mitigations, but doesn't that technology have the potential to have a very high RSC? And while you're constrained, in the number of miles of conductor that can be covered or undergrounded because of so many constraints, does that technology offer the ability to expedite mitigation of this hazard in a big way in this ramp and then in the next GRC? I'm just wondering if it could deserve a more prominent analysis in this ramp.
Well, from one perspective, the analysis for each of the mitigations is sort of equal. We put them out there and we discuss them. If you want to ask more questions about one, we're happy to do that. Advanced protection that I described is a big, one of our big efforts. And we do think think of it exactly as you said. There's these efforts that are in place that target specific assets, but, we don't want to just only rely on those. We want to rely on these sort of system-wide things like, unfortunately, PSPS and system protection and different tools. We have sensitive settings. We turn off our reclosers. There's a lot of things we do at the system level that, we try to, they're kind of panaceas to some extent while we're buying time to do the more system hardening. I don't think we've found a panacea that it says we would never have to system harden anywhere in the future because of these. We haven't gotten to that point. They're just making the risk go down, and a big chunk of it at a time, while we're targeting those areas that should be system hardened. Sarah or Jonathan, is there anything you want to add to how I just answered Chris's question?
Thanks, Mason. Yeah, we haven't really reached a point where system fault protection or just replacing assets like fuses and transformers and lightning arresters and so on is going to replace the grid hardening. So we're not doing it instead of, we're doing it as we're planning the grid hardening. So in the interim, right, doing it in the interim, as well as doing it in complementing with the grid hardening. So when we do, replace our wood poles with steel poles and replace the, bare wire, small wire to covered conductor, we're also changing out the assets, the other assets, like fuses and transformers and things like that are as a part of it. But so we're not doing one or the other, but we are doing things in the interim as well as doing it in addition to.
Okay, I appreciate that. So I would just say if it's possible, I know we have, a workshop set aside later on to discuss some of the alternative mitigations. And if there were more information that could be provided, like when you talk about you're doing this in addition to these other mitigations, if there were information that could be talked about in terms of how many miles of circuit that you're adding this advanced circuit protection to, or these other alternatives, if there's an opportunity to learn more about that in terms of number of miles and any RSC information on that, I'd be very interested in learning more about that at the next workshop, at our Cal Advocates workshop.
I think that sounds good, Chris. I want to just clarify that I wouldn't call that an alternative. We are proposing to do that in addition, as Jonathan said, in addition. We use the word alternative in the ramp to mean like, we looked at it, we're not going to do it, or we looked at it and it's not in our original request, but we may add it later. Advanced protection is in the, I shouldn't say request, but it is in our main body mitigations that we will propose in the GRC. It's not technically an alternative.
Understood. I appreciate that. And if there could be some numbers assigned in terms of, I mean, right now you're talking about, so many hundreds of miles of undergrounding.
Yeah.
But if there could be that information in terms of how many miles of this advanced circuit protection that you're planning, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the request. And Joe, I'm sure you'll make a note of that and we'll do our best to answer that at the next workshop.
And this is
One
Wendy.
thing.
I want to also just say that it would be really nice to understand more in depth advanced system protection, different kinds of advanced system protection, because if you're doing protection for, direct contact versus, arcing, or different, different types of protection, whether you have to replace equipment or you're just actually modifying protection schemes, that kind of information would be really helpful too.
I agree, Wendy. I'm not an engineer. I didn't come into the company as an engineer, but I've worked with system protection quite a bit. And it is an interesting, complicated topic, and it all depends on which assets you have in place and what you're going for, whether it be, high or low impedance. There's a lot of things to it. And if we have time, it would be nice to include all those sort of notions, like what do we get out of turning off our reclosers, and what do we get out of sensitive settings? We've done studies on those, and I think we could communicate what we get out of that. And like to answer Chris's question, how much of our system do we plan on putting the advanced protection on, and what do we think it's going to be, finding? Is it going to be preventing low or high impedance faults or ground faults? Those types of questions. I think it's a great topic myself.
If I could chime in, this is Sarah. If I could have a small request, I hope, for the next workshop. Chris, if there are new questions that you would like us to prepare for, we would really appreciate getting those ahead of time. I think to some extent today we were pulling some things on the go, which is totally understandable, but it really would be helpful for us to know ahead of time what things we need to have handy and ready to go, understanding that some of the conversation is dynamic. But if you do have some updated questions you think you're going to want to ask next week, we would love to see those.
Sure. So we did as directed, we did send an updated list, and I think you have that, and I think you're already working around that. But yeah, we didn't dive into, specific about, how many miles of RECOL or other type of advanced circuit protection or relay protection that you're planning or that you're proposing, or if you could walk us through that, that would be of great interest. So we can shoot you an email to that, or just to recapture that if you like.
We'll make a note of that. I was just thinking if there are other things that come to mind that weren't brought up today.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to stop sharing now, unless anybody has any other questions about the work papers. Okay, there we go. I realized
Just
my
gonna note, Mason, it looks like Joe clarified historical is 2016 to 2020. That's correct? In the chat, I'm looking at the chat.
What I clarified in my note where I mentioned where the work papers are, for purposes of historic dollars and purposes of forecast dollars and units, those years are 2000 and what did I say, 16 through 20 and 23 through 24. To the extent during today's workshop when you were asking questions about 5-year historic, and Sean mentioned, I believe, 2015 through 2019, those are for, for different purposes, there may be different historic years. And so all I was saying is that for the work papers we posted on the website with regards to historic dollars, recorded dollars, and forecast dollars and units, those are 16 through 20 and 22, 3, and 4.
But I'll add, I think Tom had a good point earlier, Wendy, about maybe clarifying some of the rows or some of the data. And I think we'll revisit what we've got and try to make sure those clarifications are made. Depending on when analysis was done, we had an available data set. It all depends. And we want to make that clear which data set we were looking at.
I would be surprised if it didn't include 2020 for the historical. I mean, you filed in May, and I think you have outage data by then. So it would definitely be helpful to understand what fault data. I think that was to the fault data, historical.
Yeah, real quickly, we don't seal our reliability books until like February or so, and we start the RAMP filings and the WMP filings well in advance of February. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was from the year before. But it's part of we want the WMP and the RAMP to look as close together. I know people had made the suggestion we do that. And so a lot of the data comes from the WMP timeframe, which is a little bit earlier in the year than the RAMP filing was. We certainly would use the most readily available, the most available data, the most recent available data that we could when the analysis started, though. There's no reason we would use older data on purpose. It would be more just for a practical purpose. I realized my camera wasn't on the whole time. I know you guys want to see my smiling face, but so, hey, Tom. I think I'm good.
We missed seeing your face when the alarm went off. That would have been a good picture.
Yeah, fire alarm during a wildfire talk. Nice.
If I could just reiterate one request, if you could really think hard about getting us the wings work paper broken into the 4 work papers I mentioned. It would be very helpful to see how that one dovetails with the other work papers, because right now they're not in sync. At least not on the face, they're not in sync. They may very well be in sync, but we can't really verify that.
Yeah, we will work on that, Tom.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other last words, questions by any of the parties on the line, or Fred?
Thank you, Joe. I'm fine. I appreciate all the discussion today.
All right, great. And as I mentioned up front, there is the next workshop, the 3rd of 5 that's scheduled, is slated for next Wednesday, the 8th. It will focus on the wildfire questions that LPAO submitted. Just FYI, what I may do in advance, because their questions included some illustrations and things like that, I just may forward the questionnaire, the document that they sent, which has questions with regards to non-wildfire risks. But that may be the best way to just let folks know the questions that CalPAO had submitted. And again, this is the document that they submitted. I think they provided it to the whole service list back a couple weeks back, but that might be the easiest way for me to summarize the questions that CalPAO submitted, because there's illustrations and things like that, just letting you know ahead of time.
Thank you, Joe. And maybe I could ask one quick question. So we had a discussion before about, like, in our document, it mentions bare conductor and SDG&E is going to talk about that in terms of RSE and that. Is that correct?
I believe so. Each of the
Okay.
questions you have, and we tried to address Tom's with turns today, and certainly to the extent you had questions, we're going to do our best to be answering those. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. If there's no other questions, certainly appreciate everyone's involvement. The discussion, thought it was very positive, and probably many of you will be seeing and talking with next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.